Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I decided to take a solo camping trip in the Colorado Rockies. I'd been up there before with friends, but never alone. I wanted some peace and quiet, away from the city, and the idea of being surrounded by nature felt like the perfect escape. I picked a spot deep in the forest, away from the usual trails, where I knew I'd have some privacy. The first day went smoothly. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and just enjoyed the calm of the forest. The sun was shining, and there wasn't a sound except for the occasional bird or rustle in the bushes. By the time the sun started to set, I had a small fire going, and I sat there, feeling more relaxed than I had in a long time. But as the night came on, I started to feel a little uneasy. It wasn't anything specific at first, just a sense that something was off. The forest around me was too quiet, like everything had gone still. I told myself it was just nerves from being out there alone, so I forced myself to relax. As I lay in my tent that night, I thought I heard footsteps outside. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or something moving through the trees. But the steps sounded too heavy, too deliberate. I stayed quiet, listening, my heart beating faster. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped, and I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I found something strange. Around my campsite, the ground was disturbed, like someone had been walking around during the night. It wasn't just one set of footprints either, but several, circling the area where I'd been sleeping. My first thought was that it must have been animals, but the tracks were clearly human. I started to feel uneasy, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just hikers passing through, though I hadn't seen anyone around since I arrived. I decided to shake it off and enjoy the rest of my day. I hiked up a nearby trail, keeping an eye out for anyone, but the forest was empty. By the time I got back to my campsite, it was late afternoon. The feeling of being watched had grown stronger throughout the day. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but there was never anyone there. I started to regret coming out here alone. That night, the footsteps returned. I was lying in my tent, trying to sleep, but I couldn't ignore the sound of someone moving around outside. It wasn't just walking this time. I heard twigs snapping, and the distinct sound of something being dragged across the ground. My heart was pounding, but I didn't move. I just lay there, too scared to even breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I waited for what felt like hours before I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent and look outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow over the campsite. There was no one there, but I could see the tracks in the dirt, fresh and clear. Someone had been out there, watching me. I didn't sleep much that night. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my things, ready to head back to my car. But as I was packing, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tied to a tree near my campsite was a small bundle of sticks and leaves, arranged in a way that looked deliberate, almost like a warning. I left in a hurry, but as I made my way back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often, I hear a branch snap or leaves rustle behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. I walked faster, almost running at some points, desperate to get out of that forest. I reached my car by late afternoon, exhausted and on edge. But when I got there, I found another unsettling sign. My car had been tampered with. The tires were slashed, and the windows had been smeared with something that looked like mud or blood. Whoever had been following me wanted to make sure I couldn't leave easily. I was stuck, miles from the nearest town, with no cell service. I had no choice but to start walking, hoping to find help before nightfall. The whole time, I kept hearing those footsteps, always just out of sight, following me through the trees. As the sun began to set, I finally saw headlights in the distance. A car was coming up the road, and I waved it down frantically. The driver, an older man, stopped and let me in. I told him what had happened, but he didn't seem surprised. He said there were stories about people going missing in these woods, and that I was lucky to have made it out. We drove to the nearest town, and I called the police. They went out to the campsite, but they didn't find anyone. They did find the bundle of sticks I mentioned, though, and they said it wasn't the first time they'd seen something like that. There were reports of people disappearing around that area, but nothing was ever confirmed. I've thought about the trip a lot since then, and I'm still not sure who was out there or what they wanted. But I know one thing for sure, I'm never going camping alone again. I decided to take a solo camping trip to a national park in Utah. I had been there once before, but only for a day hike. This time, I wanted to really immerse myself in the wilderness, away from everything. The idea of being alone in nature was something I looked forward to. I found a spot that was far from the main trails, surrounded by tall trees and rocky cliffs. It felt like I was the only person in the world. On my second day, while I was setting up camp for the night, a van pulled up nearby. It surprised me because I thought I had chosen a remote enough spot, but they were the only other people I had seen all day. A couple got out, smiling and waving. They looked like your typical outdoorsy types, suntanned, in their 30s maybe, with hiking boots and all the gear. They introduced themselves, saying they were just passing through and saw my campfire. At first, they seemed friendly enough. We talked for a while, mostly about hiking and camping. They told me they'd been traveling across the country, visiting national parks, living out of their van. It sounded like a nice life. They offered me a beer, which I accepted, and we sat around the fire, talking about the best trails in the park. As the night wore on, though, something started to feel off. The woman, Sarah, kept asking questions that felt too personal. At first, it was just about my trip, why I was camping alone, how long I planned to stay, but then it got more uncomfortable. She wanted to know where I was from, if anyone knew where I was, if I had a partner waiting for me back home. The man, Jake, was quieter but had this way of watching me that made my skin crawl. He would smile, but his eyes never seemed to match it. I tried to keep the conversation light, but they kept steering it back to me, my plans, my life. It felt like they were trying to size me up. I started to get a bad feeling, so I made an excuse about being tired and needing to turn in for the night. I thought that would be the end of it, but they didn't seem ready to leave. Instead, they suggested we all camp together, saying it was safer that way. Jake even offered to help move my tent closer to their van. I refused, saying I liked my spot and was used to being on my own. They exchanged a look that made my stomach drop. It was like they were silently agreeing on something that didn't involve me. Sarah then said they had some extra supplies in the van if I needed anything, food, water, whatever. She insisted I at least come take a look. I hesitated, but they were both staring at me, waiting. I felt cornered, like I had no choice but to agree. So, I followed them to the van, my heart pounding. When we got to the van, Jake opened the back doors, and I saw the inside was crammed with stuff, blankets, camping gear, boxes of food. But something about it felt wrong. There was a smell, something chemical, and I noticed some of the items looked out of place, like the kind of things you wouldn't need for camping. I saw a roll of duct tape, a box of zip ties, and a large, empty cooler. Before I could react, Sarah grabbed my arm, not hard, but enough to make me tense up. She smiled and said I should really consider staying with them for the night, for safety. The way she said it wasn't comforting, it felt like a threat. Jake was just standing there, blocking my way back to my camp. I forced a smile and said I appreciated the offer but really preferred to be on my own. I tried to pull my arm away, but Sarah held on a second longer than she needed to, her nails digging into my skin just a bit. When she finally let go, I backed away, saying I needed to get back to my camp. As I turned to leave, Jake spoke up for the first time in a while. He said, "You know, it's easy to get lost out here. No one would find you for days." His tone was casual, but the words hit me like a punch. I didn't respond. I just kept walking, not too fast, trying to seem calm. When I got back to my camp, I didn't bother with the fire. I went straight to my tent, but I didn't get inside. Instead, I grabbed my backpack and started packing up my things as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking, and I was trying to stay focused, but all I could think about was getting out of there before they decided to come back. As I was packing, I heard footsteps. I froze, listening. They were slow, deliberate, getting closer. I peeked out of the tent and saw them standing by the edge of my campsite, just watching. They didn't say anything, didn't move closer, but they were too close for comfort. I had to leave. I stuffed everything into my pack, not caring if it was organized, and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't bother with my tent. I could come back for it later, or not at all. I just needed to get out of there. I started walking down the trail, trying to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see them following me. The darkness of the forest seemed to close in around me, every rustle of leaves sounding like footsteps. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the main trailhead where I had parked my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling, and finally got inside. As I started the engine, I looked back down the trail, half expecting to see them standing there, but there was no one. I drove out of that park as fast as I could, not caring about the speed limit or the curse in the road. My mind was racing with what had just happened, the way they had turned from friendly to threatening so quickly. I kept driving until I reached a town, somewhere with lights and people. The next morning, I reported the encounter to the park rangers, but there wasn't much they could do. They said they'd keep an eye out, but they didn't seem too concerned. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had gotten too close to something terrible, something that could have ended very differently. I've been camping since then, but I'm more cautious now, more aware of who's around me. I still think about that couple sometimes, wondering what they were really planning that night, and how close I came to finding out. I had been camping alone in a remote part of Maine. I needed the solitude, a break from everything. The campsite was deep in the woods, far from the main trails. It was the kind of place where you didn't expect to see anyone, especially this late in the season. The air was crisp, and the trees were starting to turn, painting the forest in shades of red and gold. I set up my tent by a small clearing, close to a stream, and spent the first day hiking around, enjoying the quiet. On the second day, I was sitting by the fire I'd made, cooking up some dinner when I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, crunching on the leaves. I looked up and saw a man in a ranger uniform walking toward my campsite. I hadn't seen anyone else since I got there, so it caught me off guard. He was tall, with a scruffy beard, and his uniform looked a bit worn, like it had seen better days. He greeted me with a nod and said he was just doing a routine check of the area. His voice was deep, and there was something off about it, a flatness that didn't match the smile on his face. He asked me how long I'd been out there, and if I'd seen anyone else around. I told him I'd been there since yesterday and hadn't seen a soul. He nodded again, then said he needed to check my campsite, make sure everything was in order. That seemed strange to me, but I didn't want to argue. I hadn't done anything wrong, and I figured it was just some kind of protocol. I stepped aside and let him look around. He started walking through my campsite, poking at my gear with the tip of his boot, lifting the corners of my tarp, checking my tent. The whole time, he kept talking, asking me questions about where I was from, why I was out here alone. His questions were casual, but there was something off about the way he asked them, like he was more interested in the answers than he should have been. As he was rifling through my stuff, I noticed he didn't have a name tag on his uniform. That struck me as odd. Every ranger I'd ever met had one. When I asked him about it, he paused, just for a second, before saying it must have fallen off somewhere along the trail. He didn't sound convincing, and that's when I started to feel uneasy. I watched him more closely after that. The way he moved, the way his eyes darted around, it didn't sit right with me. He wasn't just checking my campsite, he was looking for something, or maybe trying to hide something. His behavior became more erratic, like he was getting frustrated. He started asking the same questions again, his voice a little more insistent each time. I could feel my heart start to race, a tightness in my chest. When he was done, he stood there, staring at me. The smile had faded from his face, replaced by a hard look that made my skin crawl. He told me I needed to pack up and leave, that this area was off limits for camping. I knew that wasn't true. I'd done my research, gotten the permits. There was no way this spot was restricted. I told him that, trying to keep my voice steady, but he just stepped closer, towering over me. He repeated that I needed to leave, his tone more forceful this time, almost threatening. I could see his hand twitch near his belt, where a flashlight hung, but there was no gun, no radio. Nothing that a real ranger would have. That's when it hit me, this guy wasn't a ranger at all. My mind started racing, trying to figure out what to do. I was miles away from the nearest ranger station, no cell service, and it was getting dark. If this guy wasn't who he said he was, then what did he want? My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there, but I didn't want to make any sudden moves. I had to play it cool, act like I wasn't onto him. I told him I'd pack up right away, trying to sound cooperative. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me with those cold eyes. I started gathering my things, moving slowly, keeping an eye on him. Every time I looked up, he was closer, like he was waiting for the right moment to make his move. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was toying with me, enjoying the control he had over the situation. I kept glancing at the tree line, thinking about making a run for it, but I didn't know if I'd get far. The thought of being chased through the woods by this guy was terrifying, but staying there with him felt just as dangerous. As I finished packing, I noticed he had drifted over to the edge of the clearing, his back to me. It was the first time he wasn't staring at me, and I knew this might be my only chance. I tightened the straps on my pack, making sure everything was secure, and slowly started moving toward the path that led back to my car. I tried to keep my steps quiet, but every crunch of leaves under my boots sounded like thunder in my ears. I was halfway to the path when he turned around. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a split second, we just stared at each other. Then he started walking toward me, not running, but with a purpose that made my blood run cold. I bolted. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced them to move, to push through the underbrush. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him behind me, his footsteps pounding on the ground, getting closer. The trees blurred past as I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had no idea where I was going, just that I had to get away. The trail twisted and turned, and I nearly lost my footing a few times, but I kept going. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I could still hear him, closer now, and I knew he was gaining on me. The thought of what would happen if he caught me made my legs move faster, the adrenaline pushing me forward. I burst out onto the dirt road where my car was parked, my lungs burning, legs aching. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door just as he broke through the trees, his face twisted in anger. He lunged at the car as I jammed the key into the ignition, his hands slapping against the window. I turned the key, praying the engine would start. It roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal, tires spinning in the dirt as I tore down the road. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, watching me drive away, his figure growing smaller and smaller until it was swallowed by the trees. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. My hands were still shaking as I pulled into a gas station, the reality of what just happened hitting me all at once. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm down, to make sense of it. Who was that guy? What did he want? The questions swirled in my mind, but I didn't have any answers. I reported the incident to the local authorities, but they didn't seem to take it too seriously. They said they'd send someone out to check the area, but I could tell they thought I was overreacting. Maybe they were right, maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed in the moment. But deep down, I knew I'd narrowly escaped something terrible. I was hiking in the Appalachians, deep in the woods of West Virginia, when I stumbled across a campsite. At first, it seemed like any other tent setup, a small fire pit, even some camping chairs. But as I got closer, I noticed something was off. There was no one around, and everything looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Food was left out, half-eaten, and a pot of water was still sitting on a cold fire pit. I walked around, calling out, but no one answered. The campsite had this eerie stillness, like it was frozen in time. I figured maybe the campers had gone for a hike, but the longer I looked, the less that made sense. Backpacks were lying on the ground, one of them unzipped, with clothes spilling out. No one would leave their stuff like that. It felt wrong, but I couldn't just walk away. Something about it drew me in, like I needed to understand what had happened. I started looking through their things, hoping to find a clue. There were 2 tents, both zipped up. I hesitated, but then I opened the first one. Inside, there were sleeping bags laid out, a flashlight, some books, but no sign of anyone. The second tent was the same, just stuff, no people. It looked like whoever had been here left in the middle of whatever they were doing, but where had they gone? As I stood there, I realized how quiet it was. No birds, no rustling in the bushes, nothing. Just dead silence. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My skin prickled, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. Every crack of a branch made me jump. I decided to leave, but before I did, I took a quick look around the area, just to see if there were any trails or signs of where the campers might have gone. As I moved further from the campsite, the trees seemed to close in, the light filtering through the leaves growing dimmer. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shoe, just lying there on the ground, half covered in leaves. It was a woman's hiking boot, scuffed up like it had been dragged. Nearby, there was a torn piece of fabric, maybe from a jacket. I didn't want to go any further, but something told me I needed to see where this led. I followed the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. The path twisted through the trees, and every step I took felt heavier, like the air itself was thickening around me. I started hearing things, 2 soft footsteps that weren't mine, faint rustling, like someone was moving through the woods, just out of sight. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or animals, but deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. The trail led me to a small clearing, and that's when I saw it, another piece of clothing, this time a hat, and more signs of a struggle. The ground was disturbed, dirt kicked up, and there were broken branches scattered around. Whoever had been here, they hadn't left willingly. I knew I should have turned back, but I couldn't. I kept going, even though every instinct was telling me to run. The further I went, the more the forest felt like a trap, like it was closing in around me. I started to hear breathing, heavy, labored breathing, but it wasn't mine. I froze, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it seemed to echo from all directions. Then I saw it, a figure, just at the edge of my vision, slipping between the trees. It was tall, hunched over, and moved with an unnatural speed. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it wasn't an animal. My heart was racing, and I turned to leave, but when I looked back, the figure was closer. It wasn't trying to hide anymore. Panic set in. I started running back toward the campsite, my feet stumbling over roots and rocks. I could hear it behind me, that breathing, closer and closer. I didn't dare look back. The campsite was in sight, but it felt like it was miles away. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of something chasing me through the woods, the crack of branches underfoot. When I burst back into the clearing, I grabbed my backpack and ran. I didn't stop to check if it was following me. I just ran, faster than I ever have in my life. The trees blurred past, and all I could think about was getting out of those woods. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, but eventually, I saw the road through the trees. I didn't stop running until I was at my car, fumbling with the keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. When I finally got in, I locked the doors and just sat there, gasping for breath, my eyes glued to the tree line. But nothing came out of the woods. The forest was still, as if nothing had happened. I don't know what I saw that day or what happened to those campers. I reported it to the rangers, but they didn't find anything, no trace of the campsite, no belongings, nothing. They said it must have been my imagination, that the woods play tricks on you when you're alone. But I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't alone in those woods. I haven't gone hiking since. Every time I close my eyes, I see that figure in the trees, hear that breathing in my ear. I decided to take a break from everything and camp by the river in the Ozark Mountains. I found a spot that was pretty secluded, away from the usual campsites. I just wanted to get away from it all for a couple of days, clear my head. The first day was perfect, just me and the sounds of the river and the forest. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and just sat there, enjoying the quiet. In the evening, as the sun started to dip below the mountains, I noticed a group of 3 men walking along the riverbank. They were rough-looking, with dirty clothes and a kind of wildness about them. They saw me sitting by the fire and came over. I didn't want to be rude, so I waved them over. They introduced themselves, though I can't remember their names now. I wasn't too worried at first. They were just drifters, probably passing through. We talked for a bit, and they seemed all right, maybe a bit off, but nothing that set off alarm bells right away. One of them asked if they could share my fire for a while. I didn't see the harm in it, so I said sure. I offered them some of my food, and they accepted, but the way they ate, like they hadn't had a decent meal in days, made me uneasy. Still, I told myself not to judge. Times are tough for a lot of people. As the night went on, the mood shifted. They started drinking from a flask one of them had, and their talk got louder, more aggressive. They kept asking about where I was from, how long I was planning to stay, and if anyone knew I was out here. I started getting a bad feeling in my gut. They were getting too interested in me, in whether I was alone. One of them, the biggest of the three, kept staring at me in a way that made my skin crawl. He asked if I had anything valuable in my tent, and when I said no, he just smiled this crooked smile and didn't say anything. The other two started laughing, but there was nothing funny about it. It was like they knew something I didn't. I tried to keep calm, but I knew I had to get out of there. I told them I was going to turn in for the night, hoping they'd take the hint and leave. But they didn't. They just stayed by the fire, talking in low voices that I couldn't quite make out. I went into my tent, but I didn't sleep. I just sat there, listening to them outside, my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like hours, I heard footsteps coming closer to the tent. One of them whispered something, and I heard the sound of a knife being pulled from a sheath. I froze, not knowing what to do. My gear was in the tent with me, but nothing that could really defend myself against three guys with knives. I decided I couldn't just sit there and wait for them to make the first move. I grabbed the closest thing I had to a weapon, a heavy flashlight, and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. When I stepped out, they were right there, standing around the fire, staring at me like they were waiting for something. The big one was holding a knife, his eyes locked on me. Before I could think, I swung the flashlight at him with everything I had. It caught him off guard, and I managed to knock the knife out of his hand. He stumbled back, cursing, but the other two lunged at me. I barely had time to react. I hit one of them in the face, but the other grabbed my arm and twisted it behind my back, forcing me to drop the flashlight. I was on the ground, struggling to break free, when I heard the big guy yell something. I didn't catch what he said, but whatever it was made the guy holding me down loosen his grip for just a second. That was all I needed. I kicked back as hard as I could, catching him in the knee. He let go, and I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing for a way out. They were coming at me again, and I knew I couldn't take all three of them. I bolted for the river, hoping I could lose them in the dark. I could hear them shouting behind me, crashing through the underbrush. I ran until my lungs burned, the cold air stabbing at my throat. When I reached the river, I didn't stop. I plunged into the water, letting the current carry me downstream. The water was freezing, but I didn't care. I kept going, staying low, trying to stay quiet. I could hear them on the bank, cursing and calling out to each other, but they didn't follow me into the river. I let the current take me as far as I could before I climbed out, shivering and exhausted. I didn't know where I was, but I kept moving, putting as much distance between me and them as possible. Eventually, I found a dirt road, and after what felt like hours of walking, I flagged down a car. The driver looked at me like I was crazy when I told him what had happened, but he let me in and drove me to the nearest town. I didn't report it to the police. I just wanted to get as far away from those mountains as I could. I don't know what those guys were planning, but I'm sure it wasn't anything good. I arrived at Yosemite National Park in the late afternoon, excited to spend a few days camping on my own. It was something I had planned for months, just me, nature, and some peace. I found a great spot, not too far from the trail but far enough to feel like I had the place to myself. The area was open, with plenty of space between sites. I set up my tent, got my fire ready, and was looking forward to a quiet evening. Not long after I had everything set up, a man arrived and started setting up his camp. It caught me off guard because there was so much open space, yet he chose to set up pretty close to me. Close enough that I could hear him muttering to himself as he unpacked. I felt uneasy right away. It wasn't the norm for someone to camp that close when there were plenty of other spots available. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself he was probably just a loner like me. I decided to be polite and walked over to say hi. He was in his late 40s, scruffy, with clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He barely looked at me, just grunted in response when I introduced myself. His hands were shaking as he fiddled with his gear. There was something off about him, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As the sun started to set, I kept an eye on him. He didn't seem interested in starting a fire or cooking anything. Instead, he just sat there, staring at his tent, not really doing anything. I tried to focus on my own evening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time I glanced his way, I found him staring at me. It wasn't a casual glance, it was a hard, focused stare, like he was sizing me up. I decided to ignore him, hoping he'd lose interest. I went back to my tent, zipped it up, and tried to settle in for the night. I could still feel his eyes on me, even with the tent between us. It felt like he was right outside. My gut told me not to sleep, to stay alert. I wished I had something more than a small pocket knife with me, but I hadn't anticipated needing anything else. Hours passed, and I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, small rustlings that I tried to dismiss as animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there, moving around my tent. My heart pounded with every sound. I was trapped in my own mind, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe loudly. Then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside my tent. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. The footsteps stopped right at the entrance to my tent. I saw the shadow of his feet through the fabric, just standing there. He didn't say anything, didn't move. He just stood there. My heart was beating so fast I thought it might burst. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something. I grabbed the pocket knife and held it tight, praying he'd go away. But he didn't. I could hear him breathing now, shallow and heavy. Then, without warning, the zipper on my tent started to move. Slowly, like he was trying not to wake me. But I was already wide awake, every nerve in my body on fire. I didn't wait for him to open the tent all the way. I lunged forward, slashing blindly with the knife, screaming at the top of my lungs. I don't know if I hit him or just scared him, but he stumbled back, cursing. I heard him fall, then scramble to his feet. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my flashlight and my car keys, bolted out of the tent, and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't know if he was chasing me or not, but I ran like my life depended on it. The darkness made everything harder, but I didn't care. I just kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps, until I finally saw the lights of the parking lot. I made it to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I didn't wait to catch my breath. I started the car and sped out of there, not caring about the gear I'd left behind. As I drove, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him chasing me, but the road behind me was empty. It wasn't until I was miles away, back in civilization, that I finally let myself cry. The adrenaline was wearing off, and all that was left was the terror. I found a motel and checked in, not even bothering to explain why I looked like I'd been through hell. I just needed to be somewhere with walls and a locked door. I never reported it. What would I say? That a man at Yosemite scared me so badly I ran away? I didn't even know his name. But I knew, deep down, that he wasn't just going to scare me. He was going to do something far worse if I hadn't reacted. I had been camping alone in a forest clearing in Vermont for 3 days. The spot was beautiful, quiet, and far from any other people, just how I liked it. The first night went by without any issues. I set up my tent, made a fire, and cooked some dinner. The stars were out, and everything felt peaceful. But on the second night, I noticed something strange. It was around midnight when I first saw it, a small light flickering in the distance through the trees. At first, I thought it was just another camper. Maybe someone who had set up nearby. But it didn't make sense because I hadn't seen anyone else all day, and the nearest campsite was miles away. The light moved slowly, bobbing up and down like someone was walking with a flashlight. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just assumed it was someone passing through, maybe taking a night hike or something. It stayed in the distance, never coming closer, so I went to sleep. The next night, I saw the light again. This time, it was closer. Maybe 100 yards away, just on the edge of the clearing. It moved the same way, slowly, almost methodically. I stood at the entrance of my tent and watched it for a while, trying to figure out what it was. I even called out, but no one answered. The light just hovered there for a while, then slowly faded back into the trees. I started to feel uneasy. I hadn't seen any other hikers or campers during the day, and this light was starting to feel out of place. But I tried to brush it off. Maybe someone else had found a spot nearby, and I just hadn't noticed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. On the fourth night, the light appeared again. This time, it was even closer, right at the edge of my campsite. I could see it clearly now, a bright white beam moving slowly from side to side. It was searching for something, or someone. I didn't like it. I didn't like that it kept getting closer every night. I felt like I was being watched, like whoever was holding that flashlight knew I was there. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the fire going, hoping the light would stay away, but it didn't. It hovered there for hours, just outside the circle of light from my fire. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and every little sound made me jump. When morning finally came, I was exhausted but relieved. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I was determined to finish my trip. I told myself it was nothing, just another camper or maybe even a park ranger. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, I was ready. I kept my flashlight and my knife close by. I didn't even bother getting into my tent. I just sat by the fire, waiting for the light to appear. And it did. This time, it was right at the edge of my campsite, barely 50 feet away. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to stay calm. I called out again, louder this time. "Who's there?" I shouted into the darkness. The light stopped moving. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, slowly, the light started moving towards me. I stood up, gripping my knife tightly. My flashlight was in my other hand, and I pointed it towards the light, trying to see who was out there. But the beam of my flashlight wasn't strong enough to reach that far. All I could see was the other light getting closer and closer. I started backing up, my mind racing. I didn't want to turn my back on whatever was out there, but I also didn't want to stay and find out what it was. The light kept coming, and I could hear footsteps now, soft but deliberate, crunching on the leaves and twigs. Then, out of the darkness, a voice spoke. It was low and raspy, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't be here," it said. My blood ran cold. There was no mistaking it. Whoever was out there wasn't a camper or a ranger. They were here for me. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. I could hear the footsteps behind me, getting faster, almost running now. The flashlight beam danced around me as I sprinted through the trees, trying to lose them. I tripped over a root and went sprawling to the ground. My flashlight flew out of my hand and went out. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and looked back. The light was still coming, now just a few yards away. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed my flashlight and ran again, not caring where I ended up. Finally, I burst out of the trees and onto a dirt road. I looked around wildly, trying to get my bearings. The light was still behind me, but it had stopped moving. It just hovered there at the edge of the forest, like whoever was holding it didn't want to leave the cover of the trees. I didn't stop to think. I ran down the road until I reached my car, which was parked a few miles away. I fumbled with the keys, got in, and sped off, not looking back until I was miles away. I don't know who that person was or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure: I was being hunted. They were watching me, getting closer and closer each night, and if I hadn't left when I did, I'm not sure I'd be here to tell this story. I was hiking alone in the wilderness in Montana. I'd done it before, nothing too serious, just some trails and camping to get away from everything. It was supposed to be a week to clear my head, be alone with nature, and enjoy the quiet. It was the third day when I wandered off the main trail, looking for a good spot to set up camp. I thought I'd found a nice, secluded area by a small stream, far from any other hikers. As I was setting up my tent, I heard something that didn't fit with the usual forest sounds. It was a muffled voice, low and strained, coming from somewhere nearby. I stopped what I was doing and listened. The voice was faint but unmistakably human. I felt uneasy but decided to check it out. Maybe someone was hurt or lost. I followed the sound, creeping through the trees, careful not to make too much noise. The voice grew louder, and I could make out a second voice, deeper and rougher. I crouched behind a thick bush and peered through the branches. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a man, standing over someone tied to a tree. The person tied up was a woman, maybe in her mid-30s, with duct tape over her mouth and her hands bound behind her back. She was sobbing, shaking her head, while the man leaned in close, whispering something I couldn't hear. He had a knife in his hand, and he was playing with it, running the blade across the woman's cheek, just enough to scare her without cutting. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. If I ran, he might hear me, and if I stayed, I might be caught. I couldn't just leave her there, though. I had to do something. I decided to back away slowly, thinking I could get to my pack, grab my phone, and call for help. But as I took a step back, I snapped a twig under my boot. The man's head whipped around, and his eyes locked onto mine. For a split second, we just stared at each other. Then he started moving toward me, fast. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise anymore. I could hear him behind me, getting closer. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. There was no one else around, no help nearby, and my car was miles away. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a small pocket knife, hardly a match for what he was carrying. I spotted a cluster of boulders up ahead and ducked behind them, trying to catch my breath and think. The footsteps behind me slowed, and I could hear him walking, searching, talking in a low, taunting voice. Come out, wherever you are," he called, his voice dripping with malice. "You shouldn't have seen that. Now we have to play." I stayed as quiet as I could, crouching low, trying to make myself as small as possible. I was praying he wouldn't find me, that he'd get bored and go back to the woman. But deep down, I knew he wouldn't. He had a sick game in mind, and I was the new target. The footsteps came closer, and I could see his boots through the gaps in the rocks. He was right there, just a few feet away. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he'd hear it. But then, he walked past, still searching, still talking to me like I was a child hiding in a game of hide and seek. When I couldn't hear him anymore, I took the chance to move. I crawled on my hands and knees, staying low, trying to put as much distance between us as I could. I needed to find a way out of this, a way to get to safety or help. But every direction I looked seemed to lead deeper into the forest, away from any chance of rescue. I made it to a small clearing and spotted something glinting in the dirt. It was an old, rusted trap, probably left by some hunter years ago. The sight of it gave me an idea, a desperate, crazy idea, but it was all I had. I carefully pried the trap open and positioned it near a narrow path that led back toward where I'd left my gear. Then, I doubled back, moving as quietly as I could, hoping to circle around behind him. I had no real plan beyond getting the woman free and trying to escape together. But as I crept closer to where I'd last seen him, I realized he was waiting for me. He grabbed me from behind, yanking me off my feet, the knife pressed against my throat. "Clever girl," he hissed in my ear, his breath hot and rancid. But not clever enough. He dragged me back toward the campsite where the woman was tied, and I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but he was too strong. When we got back, he shoved me to the ground next to the woman. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, and I felt a wave of guilt. I'd only made things worse for both of us. He stood over us, knife in hand, grinning like he'd already won. "Now," he said, "how about we make this interesting? I'll give you a head start, 10 seconds, before I come after you. But only one of you gets to leave." I realized he was going to make us run, make us choose who would survive. It was a sick, twisted game, and there was no way to win. But I wasn't about to let him have the satisfaction. I had one last trick up my sleeve, and I prayed it would work. I glanced at the woman, then back at him, and nodded. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But let her go first." He laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Nice try. But you're both running. Now, go!" He stepped back, giving us space to get up. I helped the woman to her feet, my mind racing, looking for any chance to get out of this alive. Then, with a final look at him, I grabbed the woman's arm and bolted in the direction of the trap. He didn't give us the full 10 seconds. I could hear him coming after us almost immediately, his footsteps pounding the ground behind us. I pushed the woman ahead, urging her to run faster, not letting her stop. We reached the narrow path, and I swerved to the side, pulling her with me. We kept running, not looking back, until we heard a sharp, metallic snap followed by a scream of pain. I stopped, breathless, and turned around. He'd stepped right into the trap. The rusted metal had clamped down on his leg, and he was struggling to free himself, his face twisted in agony. I didn't wait to see if he'd get out. I grabbed the woman's hand and we ran, faster than before, not stopping until we reached the main trail. We didn't speak, just kept moving until we finally saw a group of hikers coming toward us. They helped us, called the authorities, and stayed with us until we were safe. The police found the man still stuck in the trap. He was arrested, and we later learned that he'd been wanted for several attacks in the area. I never went back to that part of the wilderness again. I still love camping, but now I'm always on edge, always looking over my shoulder, knowing that danger can come out of nowhere when you least expect it. I was out in the Smoky Mountains, just me and the trail, trying to get away from the city and clear my head. I've always liked hiking alone. Something about the quiet and the fresh air helps me think. I've been out there for a couple of days already, camping wherever I could find a good spot, nothing planned, just going where the path took me. On the third day, I decided to push a little further off the marked trails, see if I could find a spot where nobody had been for a while. It was late afternoon when I came across the tent. It was off the trail, hidden in a small clearing surrounded by trees. The first thing that struck me was how out of place it looked. There were no signs of anyone around, no fire pit, no gear, just this old, dirty tent with the flap partially open. I don't know why, but I felt this pull to check it out, like I needed to see what was inside. Maybe it was just curiosity or maybe something else. I don't know. I walked up slowly, trying to be as quiet as I could, listening for any sign of movement. But it was dead silent. The closer I got, the more I felt something was wrong. There was a smell coming from the tent, something rotten, like food left out too long, but worse. My stomach turned a little, but I kept going. When I reached the entrance, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to turn around, but another part, the part that got me into this mess, pushed me to look inside. I pulled the flap back, and that's when I saw it. Inside the tent was a mess of things that didn't make sense together. There were clothes, all crumpled and dirty, some of them with dark stains that looked like dried blood. There were ropes, some cut, some tied into loops, and an old, rusted knife stuck into the ground, its blade covered in something that had turned brown and crusty. But what really made me freeze was the pile of photographs scattered on the ground. They were all of people, some alone, some in groups, all taken in this same forest, all looking like they didn't know they were being watched. My heart was pounding, and I felt cold all over. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at those photos, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mind was racing, piecing together the bits of information that didn't fit anywhere else. The tent, the smell, the knife, it all started to add up to something terrible. I knew I had stumbled onto something bad, something dangerous, and I needed to get out of there fast. Just as I turned to leave, I heard the sound of footsteps crunching on the dry leaves, getting closer. My blood ran cold. Whoever owned this tent was coming back, and I was standing there like a deer in headlights. I ducked down, slipping out of sight behind some bushes, my heart beating so hard I could barely breathe. The footsteps got louder, then stopped right outside the tent. I could hear someone breathing heavily, and then the sound of a zipper being pulled, followed by a low, frustrated growl. I didn't dare move. I could see through a gap in the bushes as the man bent down, rummaging through the tent. He was big, with a scruffy beard and a wild look in his eyes. He pulled out the knife, turning it over in his hand, muttering to himself. Then he froze, like he suddenly realized something was off. His head snapped up, and he started looking around, scanning the trees like he was trying to find something or someone. My heart was in my throat as I slowly backed away, trying not to make a sound. But I must have stepped on a branch or something because there was this sharp crack under my boot. The man's head whipped around, and his eyes locked onto the bushes where I was hiding. For a split second, we just stared at each other, and I could see the realization in his eyes. He knew I had seen everything. He started moving toward me, the knife still in his hand, and I knew I had to run. I bolted out of the bushes, sprinting as fast as I could through the trees, not caring about the noise anymore. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush, shouting for me to stop. But there was no way in hell I was stopping. The forest was a blur around me, branches whipping my face, roots trying to trip me up, but I just kept running. I didn't know where I was going, just away from him, away from that tent. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but the thought of what that man would do if he caught me kept me going. I could hear him getting closer, the sound of his footsteps and his ragged breathing right behind me. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out, but there was nothing. The trees were thick, and I was lost, completely disoriented. I stumbled, almost fell, but somehow managed to keep my balance. I could see a break in the trees up ahead, maybe a path or a road. I just had to make it there. I burst out of the trees and onto an old, overgrown trail. I didn't stop to look back, just kept running, hoping this path would lead somewhere, anywhere but here. The footsteps behind me were getting fainter, but I didn't dare slow down. My lungs were screaming for air, but I pushed on, driven by pure fear. Finally, I reached a clearing with an old, rundown cabin. I didn't know if it was safe, but I didn't have a choice. I ran up to the door, praying it wasn't locked, and shoved it open. Inside, it was dark and dusty, like nobody had been there in years. I slammed the door shut and threw the bolt, then collapsed against it, gasping for breath. I sat there, shaking, listening for any sound of a man outside. But all I could hear was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I don't know. Eventually, I realized it was quiet, too quiet. I didn't hear him anymore, and I started to hope that maybe he'd given up, maybe he'd lost me in the woods. I stayed in that cabin until the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the walls. I was too scared to sleep, too scared to move. But when the sun finally came up, I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I had to get out of the forest, find help, and report what I'd seen. I opened the door slowly, peering out into the clearing. There was no sign of the man, no sign that he'd been there at all. But I didn't let my guard down. I kept moving, sticking to the trails this time, heading back toward where I thought the main path was. It took me hours, but I eventually found my way back to civilization. I went straight to the nearest ranger station and told them everything. They sent out a search party, but they never found the tent or the man. It was like he'd vanished, leaving no trace behind. They told me I was lucky to be alive, and I believed them. I haven't been back to the Smoky Mountains since. I don't think I ever will. I was camping alone in the Adirondacks, just a solo trip to clear my mind. It wasn't my first time out there by myself, so I wasn't too worried about anything happening. I had my tent set up in a small clearing, not too far from a stream, and I was looking forward to a quiet night. The weather was good, the air was cool, and I had everything I needed. I spent most of the day hiking around, taking photos, and just enjoying the peace. There wasn't another soul around, which is exactly how I liked it. By late afternoon, I made it back to my campsite, cooked up some dinner, and settled in for the night. As the sun started to set, I built a small fire and sat by it, listening to the sounds of the forest. Everything felt normal. That's when I heard something in the distance, footsteps on the trail. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, but as the sound got closer, I realized it was someone walking. I stood up, a little uneasy, and watched as a man came into view. He was stumbling a bit, looking rough like he hadn't slept or eaten in days. His clothes were dirty, and his face was covered in scrapes and bruises. He spotted me and started to wave, calling out for help. He said he'd been lost for days, that he couldn't find his way back to the trailhead. He looked so desperate that I couldn't just turn him away, even though something about the situation felt off. I offered him some food and water, which he took like he was starving. He kept thanking me, saying he didn't know what he would have done if he hadn't found me. As the sky darkened, I asked him where he was headed, but he was vague, saying he'd been hiking and got turned around. The whole time, he was jittery, looking around like he was expecting something. I started to feel uneasy. He wasn't acting like someone who'd just been lost, more like someone who was hiding from something. I told him he could stay by the fire for the night, but I was already planning on how to get rid of him in the morning. He kept talking, asking me questions about where I'd come from, how long I'd been out there, but he never really answered any of my questions. I started to get the feeling he wasn't lost at all, like maybe he'd been out there for a different reason. The fire was burning low, and I was getting ready to head into my tent when he asked if I had any extra blankets. I gave him one, and he just sat there, staring into the flames, muttering to himself. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but it didn't sound right. It was like he was talking to someone who wasn't there. I decided to go into my tent, but I didn't feel safe sleeping with him out there. I lay in my tent, listening to the crackle of the fire and his quiet murmuring. Every now and then, I hear him move around, shifting in his spot. I couldn't relax, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't know if he was dangerous, but I knew I wasn't going to get any sleep with him out there. Around midnight, the fire died down completely, and it got real quiet. Too quiet. I strained to listen, trying to figure out if he was still outside, but I couldn't hear anything. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a rustling right next to my tent. My heart skipped a beat. I held my breath, hoping it was just the wind or an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Suddenly, there was a tug on the side of my tent, like someone was trying to open it. I froze, not knowing what to do. The zipper started to move, slowly, like whoever was out there was trying not to make any noise. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to defend myself, but all I had was a small camping knife, nothing that would do much good if it came to a fight. I grabbed the knife and held it tight, my hands shaking. The zipper stopped, and there was silence again. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in my ears, but nothing else. Then, just when I thought maybe he'd gone away, I heard him speak, real quiet, almost a whisper. "I know you're awake," he said. His voice was low, and there was something off about it, like he was enjoying this. "I've been watching you." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just some lost hiker. He'd been out there the whole time, watching me, waiting for the right moment. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew I had to get out of there. Slowly, I reached for my phone, trying not to make a sound. I didn't want to alert him that I was moving. Before I could do anything, the tent suddenly shook violently, like he was trying to rip it open. I panicked, kicking out with my feet, hoping to knock him off balance. I could hear him grunt, and then the tent collapsed on top of me as he pulled on it from outside. I was trapped inside, tangled in the fabric, but I managed to find the zipper and claw my way out. I burst out of the tent, knife in hand, ready to defend myself, but he was gone. The campsite was empty, no sign of him anywhere. I looked around, my eyes darting to every shadow, every tree, expecting him to jump out at any moment. But all I heard was the wind in the trees and the distant call of an owl. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my backpack, leaving most of my gear behind, and started running down the trail. I didn't care where I was going, just that I needed to get away from him. My legs were burning, and I was out of breath, but I kept going, adrenaline pushing me forward. Every time I looked back, I expected to see him following me, but there was nothing. Just the dark forest closing in around me. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, finally collapsing against a tree, gasping for air. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what had just happened, what he wanted, and why he let me go. I stayed there for hours, too scared to move, too scared to go back. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I finally started walking again, heading in the direction I thought would lead me back to the main trail. It took me most of the day, but I eventually found my way out of the forest. I went straight to the nearest ranger station and told them everything. They sent out a search party, but they didn't find him. No trace of the man, no sign of my tent or the campsite, nothing. It was like he'd never been there, like it was all in my head. But I know what happened. I know he was real.